Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Judith Bessant from RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia, which is right down the bottom part of Australia. Yeah, where it is the end of summer and a little bit wet.
a little bit wet. I remember people used to say about Melbourne that if you don't like the weather today, or this hour, or this moment, stick around. Is that
Well,
cliche
that's right.
correct?
No, absolutely correct. Whenever you go out, you have to be prepared and be dressed for summer, for winter, for rain, everything. Yeah, that's Melbourne's weather.
So,
Yeah.
climate change is old hat for you guys in Melbourne.
Yeah, maybe, but not like it is today. We've always had floods and droughts, and bushfires, which are
Yes.
quite severe here, but not to the extent to which we have them now.
I read that during the Australian Open of tennis recently, there was one day when the temperature was in the 40s and centigrade, and another day when it was in the teens, separated by 24 hours.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's
That,
what I mean.
yeah,
It
yeah,
changes quickly. Yeah.
wow. Well, Prof. Basant, I wanted to begin by asking you really the thing that I pose as a query to all guests, which is what's currently dynamizing you, what's currently impeding you, what's preoccupying you, what's interesting you. And I know that
Oh,
your work
okay.
involves climate, so that might be part of the answer, but who knows?
So the first question was, Toby?
Well, you can answer about any one of these or all four.
Yeah.
What's dynamizing you? What's energizing you, if you like? What's impeding you, holding you back? What's preoccupying you, worrying? What's interesting you?
Whoa. What's dynamiting me? Um, Many of the things that dynamiting me, I haven't used that word before, but I will in the future. Um, uh, 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 my work often I work on the intersection of a number of areas. A lot of it has to do with young people in politics. And one of the things that moves me, your word dynamite, infuriates me or gets my moral emotions going, are the way in which we as elders are disregarding our responsibilities towards children,
Mm,
young people now, and those not yet born, not just human, but also non-humans as well.
yeah. Yeah.
I find that particularly disturbing
Mm,
um, because for all kinds of reasons. But that's one of the things that really does move me. One of the things that I find inspiring is the way in which young people themselves are, know what's going on, and so many of them so clear and able to articulate what they want, what they need, um, and and uh, and in some ways, I think that go back to the first observation is about that gets me down is the sense of betrayal that many young people feel,
mm,
especially towards like the political classes, the people who are meant to
mm,
be our leaders, our politicians, our political elite, corporate sector, and so on and so forth. I think there's a strong sense of betrayal on the part of many young
mm,
people, and
mm,
and more generally, it's not just young people, a loss of trust in our political leaders to do what they're meant to be doing.
mm. And I wanted to ask you, Prof, about part of your immensely distinguished career is that you recently participated in the Lancet Commission, the second Lancet Commission on adolescent health and well-being. And
Yes.
for those who don't know, the Lancet, along with JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, and the New England Journal of Medicine, NEJM, is in the English language in the top 3 medical journals in the world. And The Lancet is the one with a social conscience, I think we can say.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that it's ascientific, it's very scientific, but it actually cares about inequality and poverty and racism and sexism and so on. This is an immensely weighty report. And as I say, it's a mark of distinction that you're part of it, but a mark of distinction not only for you, but from you to the Commission. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that, because it seems to me that some of the findings there, which are utterly scarifying, I mean, they're just horrendous, show that actually the problem faced by, I think the report covers more or less 10-year-olds to 24-year-olds, that their situation in terms of health and well-being globally, where they're becoming a huge subgroup of society, is worsening.
Yes. Yes. I felt very honoured to be part of that. And you're right. It is interdisciplinary, although it's primarily most of the people involved are biomedical people,
Right.
which was a huge and wonderful learning experience for me working within those disciplines. But I was invited to be part of it as a social scientist or sociologist or political, whatever I am, medical person, by the late wonderful George Payton and Susan Sawyer, who are from Melbourne, University of Melbourne. And it was, I don't know how much you know about the Commission, but they are periodic, and this is the second one. And I was in a stream that looked specifically at the question of climate change and its impact on young people now and future generations. And so there are a number of streams and they looked at different things, and it was global and it was pretty powerful. And you've obviously read the findings, but and I think because it is such a prestigious publication, hopefully it will have some clout in terms of, maybe, this is the optimistic part of me, in terms of informing policy and laws, because the findings are fairly powerful. And as you say, the demographic of young people, children, young people, is very high, and particularly in the global south. And, you know, some of the findings were fairly horrifying in terms of, you know, basic things like, you know, physical health and well-being,
Yep.
just around nutrition, obesity, disease, access to basic needs like, you know, sanitation and shelter, and questions around forced migration. It covered everything. So it's well worth a read for anybody who's interested in that. Just came out last year. So anybody who's interested in sort of finding out what the latest is in respect to a sort of global perspective, that Lancet report is well worth a read.
And a lot of it's about Asia and Africa, because that's where a lot of the young people of the future will be. Prof, just to alert you, for those listening, I live in the global south. We have a gigantic electrical storm that just started. This often leads to the power going off. So if we're interrupted, Prof Bessant, my apologies, it will mean that everything's down, which in fact will be some release, ironically, from the violence in the streets, which has led to big fires everywhere. Anyway, enough of my incredibly interesting drama. Let's get back to the work that you do. And I wanted to ask you about this question of the definition of youth. Because on the one hand, here's this brilliant report, incredibly interesting, right? Which, in a sense, takes as understood what young people are in the context of age, right? Here's a cohort, we know that's what young people are. Some of your work has, I think, operated within that sort of paradigm, but other of your work questions the notion of there being a thing called youth. So this is
Yeah.
not meant to be a gotcha moment, Prof, at all. It's just my asking, because I find these sorts of paradoxes so interesting and complicated, how one can work through, on the one hand, this sort of public policy need to
Yeah.
say that's youth, right?
Yes.
And on the
Yeah.
other, the intellectual political need, which is not going to accept easy timelines. Does that make sense to you, Prof?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, I understand exactly what you mean because it's an issue that I have, and um, because I do work with policymakers and lawmakers and NGOs, and that category is so well ingrained, like the adolescent youth. And I always put youth in inverted commas, say young
Um,
people or children. I usually use that or try and talk about young people. At the same time, I question those categories and wrote a book a little while ago about making up people. I think it was titled something like that. That's not to say that young people or what people call youth don't exist, but it's more to pay attention to the way in which we understand young people. Um, and so I guess if I can try to put it really simply, is that when the social scientists, sociology of youth historically, youth studies, and many others have seen things sort of like in a objective way that there is youth, and you can define it and you can have this category and that's it and that's clear. Whereas my view is that it's better to understand things, and this is not new, and I draw on new materialism and Bourdieu, for example, to say that if you really want to know what's going on, you need to pay attention to the relationship. So when people say, "Oh, you're interested in you study youth, young people," I say, "Well, hang on." I'll qualify that. I study young people, but I also study ourselves. So, in order to understand the lives of young people and children, you need to understand the lives of their relation of older people and the relationships
yeah.
between older people and younger people in the institutions to understand what's going on. So that, in that sense, I always sort of qualify or put inverted commas around those. And I have one of the reasons why I've done that is because I have paid a bit of attention to the way in which those categories came into being, and that takes us, and it's a Western, global North primarily. That's not to say that children and young people don't exist, they do. But the way in which we understand them in the particular ways in which we do is informed by particular discourses that sort of go back to early 1900s and way before, to people like Stanley Hall, for example,
Yes.
who came up with the category of the adolescent. And I mean, that had a whole longer story about young people going through this period of storm and stress, agonism,
Yeah.
when, and it's the typical now idea of the adolescent as a time of trouble and troubled and being at risk. And it's such a powerful story. Its legacy is still here, it's still here. So I paid attention to what, and that was Stanley Hall and people like Cyril Burt, English old guy criminologist, who came up with the idea of the young delinquent, that it was primarily drawing very strongly on sort of Darwinian evolutionary theory and eugenics,
Yeah.
right? So that biologically and a little bit socially, white, typically male, adults were at the top of the pinnacle. Yes, like you.
Guilty, Prof.
And it went down the chain. And so they followed that kind of way of thinking. And within that, they had this idea of what they call recapitulation theory, which when I came across, I thought was wonderful, which is the idea is that children follow the evolution of humans. And this is, I haven't paid attention, so this is my dodgy memory. Um, um, Follow the evolution. So they start off as primates and evolve and evolve and evolve until they become fully adult through the human evolution. And that's the idea that these people were using,
We're
and it was
working
really,
with.
really, really powerful.
Yeah,
And so we came up with the idea of adolescence, youth. It was as a stage in the human life cycle that was universal. Everyone went through it, regardless of who you are, what country you lived in, what gender you were. So it was rooted in biology. Um, and and what we saw in young people was sort of an upwelling of the primal kind of forces that, you know, and later on they did pay a little bit of attention to the social context. That had an enormous influence on the way in which young people were understood.
right.
And particular kinds of young people, it had enormous influence in terms of policies, you know, like stolen generations, for example, and taking children in Australia in particular, where children were just abducted from their families for generations, and sterilisation, for example, the schooling system in compulsory education, that it informed a whole lot of practices. It saw the coming into being of certain professional services, and all that sort of stuff was owed very much to that discourse of those and those categories of the adolescent youth. And that's why I always kind of obviously use that language, but also question it at the same time, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. And I guess when you refer to a stolen generation, there's a specificity here, not universal, but important to places like Canada, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, where stolen generation can often mean Indigenous people uprooted from their families as part of an
Yes.
attempted transformation. And this isn't just the state and academia, this is the church, Christian church
Yeah.
also, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The church had a lot to do with it, and it was primarily Indigenous um, children who were stolen, and often put into homes, religious homes, church-based homes, where many of them were subject to horrendous abuse. Uh, but it was also working class as well, where children were taken away. And it was part of what they called an enlightenment project, or sort of civilizing project to
Mm.
civilize the savages. And you know, people still do and have historically referred to young people as savages or feral or the wild ones. So which I when I hear that, I hear as echoes of that longer history. So all those categories, I mean, even the category generations, I find, which is used a lot, I use myself, but it's got a history too. And I think it's important to pay attention to those histories, because you understand the politics involved in the creation of those categories, or ways of representing young people, and the ways in which young people are primarily, the dominant ways in which young people are primarily represented at the moment, I find problematic often, because they're represented in ways that there's a politics embedded in it.
Mm.
It's the effect of excluding them, right? Because they're um, the narrative is that their brains are not developed, or they're they're not equipped to make decisions. They don't know enough about whatever. And so they are relegated to the status of citizen in pupa or in transition, not full citizens,
Not full citizens.
therefore
Yeah.
excluded from various kinds of things like engaging in the public sphere, voting, and all that kind of stuff. So the way in which a particular group is represented is not an objective account, even though they might call it scientific, of who they are. And often it leaves out the lived experience of those people. It is the result of a often deeply political a process. And, just to take us back one step to when I was talking about young people not being equipped to be able to make decisions about matters that affect them because they're immature or they don't know enough or something. I always say, well, do we apply that to any other age cohort? Like, do we have to pass a civics test or be deemed to have knowledge about how the political system works, how the upper house works, how the lower house, who's the speaker is, where the toilet is in parliament? We have to pass that kind of test to be eligible to vote. And most, like, the answer is no.
Yeah.
So I think that the language and those sort of categories, yeah, you said there's a paradox, and it's a paradox that I'm sort of alert to and trying to sort of work on.
Right. I should say that for some time I've been trying to write a book called Making Up People. And when I discovered you'd written one with that title, I realized I needed to rethink this, not the contents, but so much as the title. But Prof, I'm thinking about, because I've mostly been able to get access to your journal articles and so on, rather than your books. There's a great piece you wrote recently with a co-author, Rob Watts, called Young and Invisible in a Time of Polycrisis, in the Journal of Youth Studies, which I think is pretty much universally available to folks who have online access. And I guess this is not so much a paradox, but or at least it's that and a duality, that young people can be too visible in the form of the critique criminologically and invisible when it comes to political power. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about that in the context of Edgar Morin's idea, now adopted by the World Bank, of polycrisis.
Oh, okay. Yes, that was written by myself and my wonderful colleague and partner in all things, Rob Watts, a couple of years ago. And it was because we got curious about that idea. There was a lot of talk here, especially after COVID, about, because it was pretty severe lockdown here for a couple of years and the schools were closed down and all that sort of stuff. And many policymakers started talking about the way in which we have, I don't know whether they use the word invisibilized, but it was something like that, of young people, and they've paid for it because they weren't considered in those decisions about whether or not to lock down schools, as they were not considered or active participants in decisions like the recent decision in Australia to ban young people under the age of 16 from social media. So in one sense, as you say, they're either marginalised, as Rancia say, the people on the outside, or invisibilised, which is problematic. But at the same time, as you say, they're complained about because they're highly visible in terms of, like, as you mentioned, with turn on the news and you'll see reports of so-called young criminals, and that influences laws like the laws that are coming in here at the moment, what they call adult crime, adult time, which means that young people are receiving severe adult sentences in one area, you know, in the sort of area of crime, law and crime, but in other areas they're deemed to be adult, but in other areas they're deemed not to be. Sorry, I'm digressing. So it is a paradox because, and especially in social media, young people have high profiles. They're everywhere. Um, in many of the climate change action in Australia and across the globe, young people were at the forefront of that from 2018. So they're highly visible. And it was just to highlight that incongruity because it just it didn't gel. So it was an exercise in bringing that to the attention of people. So thank you that you read it. It was fun to write.
Well, I love this adult crime, adult time. I've not heard that.
Yeah,
Reminds me of the Labour Party in Britain in the 90s and tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. This is public policy rendered by the pathetic dying remnants of advertising agencies and public relations liars. And it's no wonder, therefore, getting back to what you were saying earlier, that there is this disjuncture between public policy formation and the experience of young people when these absolutely idiotic slogans are used all the time by
yeah,
adults.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I wanted to ask you on the climate issue too about gender, because there's another terrific article you co-wrote with Professor Watts, but also with Professor Philippa Collin, young female climate leaders. And this has the memorable article title, very scholarly, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, well, we stole the blah 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 of Greta Thunberg because that was one of the things she said when she was referring to the ways in which policymakers and lawmakers often sort of talk. So yeah, it's I mean, looking back on it, at the time it was a discovery that so many of the leaders was an Australian case study, but this is not unique to Australia. But so many of the leaders were very young females or non-binary young people, and they were organising, mobilising, taking centre stage, and we focused in because you can only do so much in an article on their speeches and the way in which they just assumed the responsibility of what and articulated so well what was going on, and um, and so we identified that and just said, look, this is fairly significant because historically, even in like social movements, political action in the 60s and, the Vietnam War movement, so on and so forth, it was primarily men and boys who were in there. And not too often did you see girls and young women and very young women. And so we documented that and we sort of analysed their speeches because it wasn't just that they were dominant in the movement, but they were assuming leadership positions. So that article was about, but it led on to us thinking about, well, this is interesting. Where are the boys? That's not to say that there are many young men, boys and young men in climate movement, but they're not present in the way in which they had been historically, and so this is work that I'm working on at the moment, trying to identify, exactly how are what are the gender issues in this kind of politics? Where are the young men and the boys? What are they doing? So we're doing research as we speak on this. And it's taken us down various paths to look at, the kinds of ways in which they are involved in developing new kinds of sciences, and even down to the question of, do you have dumpster diving? Is that in Australia? Dumpster diving? Yeah. So we've been doing work also with some young dumpster divers and finding out why they do that and the environmental issues. It's sort of like auto ethnographic, not the sense that I get in the bins and whatever, but it's been interesting finding out what they do and how they do it in the context of um, where many people in places like Australia have trouble paying the bills, putting food on the table, and young people in particular. So it documents how they go and retrieve food that's often just put in the bins. We asked them why they do it. They talked about overconsumerism. Talked about what they did with the food and the goods. And they sort of detailed how they have opened up in one of the suburbs in Melbourne, what they call a free market in Coburg, where the food is distributed to families in that area who use it to live on. And that's a predominantly young male activity. So anyway, so that was a digression from the blah blah paper, but
No, not
yeah.
at all. That's absolutely fascinating. So, in a sense, the intellectuals of the movement for climate, against climate change that you've been looking at are more young women. And the guys who throw themselves into garbage to retrieve what shouldn't be deemed garbage are the boys.
Yeah, not all, but predominantly. Yeah. And yeah, so it's a fascinating little study too, because it's sort of, what do you call it, in that grey area of legal or criminal activity, because they were talking about how sometimes they get chased by the security guards and all that sort of thing. So yeah, but it is primarily young male activity.
Now, this gets me on to the only book of yours that I was able to get hold of. Obviously, these things are more difficult in the global south, which is a fascinating volume you co-edited with Professor Sarah Picard, Young
Oh,
People
okay.
Regenerating Politics in Times of Crises. And I wanted to ask you about this in terms of hopefulness for the future, not doom and gloom, but the idea implicit in the title, and it's a very international, very generously international volume, that there might be something better in the future. And I ask
Yes.
that in part because I've been guilty at different times in my life in placing a utopia of the future in the hands of the young.
Yeah. That's right. And it's one of the things that I think that goes to the question of intergenerational solidarity and relations, that we need to recognize the responsibility that we have to young people, to younger people, um, and not assume that they're going to be the ones that carry the burden of fixing it up. And historically, I think young people have often seen to be the heroes of various, I can't use that word here, problems. So I think that is right, not to just give them the responsibility of fixing it up and then we'll be right. And I think too that often my view is, not in all cases, but many of the people in office think in short term because they're in office for 3 years. And so the policy's got to be effective within 3 years. But what we really need is longer term thinking. And that goes against the grain when you're trying to have attained some kind of intergenerational justice. So it's more, in my view, sort of not giving young people the responsibility of fixing it up, but at the same time recognizing their capacity for political agency. So, but I also believe that, and this sort of follows on from the writing of people like Castoriadis and Cornelius Castoriadis and Ceres, and the idea of a political imaginary. And that I think that sometimes if you pay attention to what a political imaginary is, because really things happen because, first of all, if we're talking about humans, we imagine it. This is how the epoch in which we live now came through narratives and stories. And so we could ask, what does a post-anthropocentric social imaginary look like? And I've played with this idea using Castoriadis in particular to say, well, this is what he says how a social or political imaginary comes about, by assuming freedom, by imagining beyond what we are seeing now. And I think that when we look at some of the actions, and by action I include in the Arendtian sense the words of young people, we can see a new, in my view, political imaginary emerging. And in that sense, I think I think people like Hannah Arendt have some interesting, helpful things to say in terms of the way in which we renew ourselves through each generation, and each newcomer brings something new. So I don't know if that little ramble answered your question, but I think I am optimistic, cautiously, that even though, I mean, what's the alternative? But I do think that there's prospects for a social imaginary, and I think that at the moment myself and other colleagues are trying to sort of articulate and track that social imaginary, and to see what it looks like and see whether there's evidence of that in the politics of young people.
No, I think that's a great answer. I mean, one of the things that I found helpful in the book is an attempt to explain what I've experienced as I move between different countries. And for instance, in Spain, a lot of the people who have nostalgia for dictatorship,
Yeah,
brutal, ruthless, appalling, that ended 50 years ago, are the grandchildren of people who lived through that, who are
yeah,
of the ruling class. If I look at who's supporting the far right in France now, it's often young people, because the far right in France says things like no income tax until you turn 30.
yeah, yeah,
But on the other hand, there are these extraordinary movements. You mentioned Greta Thunberg, and I've spoken to lots of young Swedish people about her, whom I expected to be a bit rivalrous or contemptuous, but instead are admiring and keen to emulate her.
yeah.
I thought they might be jealous or envious or dismissive. Not at all. And so I think that allowing young people to have all the contradictions and the class and race differences and gender differences that the rest of the world has is actually the right way to go analytically as an outsider, an inexpert. And that's what I thought was wonderful about your book, that it wasn't just hopeful, though there was that, but there was, as I said, an acknowledgement that some of the binaries and the forms of subjectification that apply to all populations apply to them as well, instead of all our hopes being thrust onto them vicariously, like an angry father who wanted to be good at boxing but wasn't, and so wants his children to be.
Or tennis. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, the one thing about the category of youth or young people or children is they're not homogenous. We've got a lot of young people in the far right as well, for example. So they're similar to most other cohorts, full of contradictions and diversity, and that's a good thing.
But can I
So
ask you, Prof, you've been working on this topic for a very long time, from when you were young, actually, not what
yeah.
you're doing now, but you must have been really pretty young when you started on this. What have you seen that's changed in terms of young people or the discourse of young people or your sense of understanding young people?
Whoa, that's huge. That's a
Yes.
huge question.
Sorry.
Uh, yeah, well, we touched on some of that earlier, and I think that some things have not changed in terms of the power of those discourses that misrecognize in harmful ways young people. And I'm talking about Stanley Hall. I'm talking about, you can see that resonating in the popularity of talk around the teen brain, for example, which is a similar kind of discourse that people used to use for women, that women have got different brains or think differently or too emotional, therefore they can't vote or whatever. So we're still got that happening. But I think that in terms of the traditions, and it's not one tradition. We've gone through all of them from, structural functionalists to symbolic interactionists to Marxists to um, Southern theory, the wonderful Raewyn Connell's work, postmodernism, new materialism. I think has got a lot going for it in the sense that I can see how the people that work in that area connect with Bourdieu and see how we are not separate we're not separate entities. Humans are not separate from nature. We're not well-bounded singular entities, but we are embedded and connected to each other. And I think that sort of relational ontology is fairly critical for better understanding what's going on. And even, theorists like Latour, I find quite helpful because he talks about historically, the European tradition was to talk about human agency as belonging to the individual. But Latour is kind of good because he talks about the agency of a virus or the rain. And that kind of, to me, in my head, resonates often with many of the Indigenous worldviews that are very helpful as well. And the relationships with and the ways in which they see and give rights to a river or the mountain, for example. So I've forgotten the other part of your question.
Oh, I was just asking you whether really young people have changed, the discourse of young people has changed, your views have changed.
The discourses of young people have changed somewhat, but those adultist, as the wonderful John Wall from Rutgers University would talk in terms of adultist assumptions that are built into the way in which we understand and work with young and live with young people are still powerfully there. I think that young people have changed in their politics, and this is not to say that politics and young people is new. Young people have always been involved, played a key role in, the French Revolution, for example, in most of the major political issues, Vietnam War and so forth. But it has changed in terms of the ways in which they're engaging politically. Often it has to do with the relationship with technology. I think that has made an enormous difference in terms of not only just what kind of politics they're doing, but the way in which they can access information, news, the way in which they can exchange, communicate, the way in which they can mobilize, the way in which they can upload and make things happen. And also, like, when we talk about young people and politics and change, some of it's new, like those things I just talked about, but also, you know, some of the action young people are taking around strategic litigation. You know, we had that case in Australia with Anjala Sharma and Farsha Yaman and a number of other young people that took the federal government to court, insisting that the government exercise a duty of care, and won the case. And then the government appealed, and the appeal was upheld. And so that kind of political engagement with what do you call formal politics is happening too, but that's always happening. Blogs and newsreels are new. You might be interested in looking at Leonardo Puglisi, the Australian young guy. I think he started when he was in primary school, set up a newsreel using courtesy of social media, and became very, very successful and influential politically, interviewing, you know, prime ministers and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I suppose what I'm saying is that there's a diversity of political action that young people are now involved in, which I think has much to do with their access and relationship with new forms of technology.
And to finish things up, Prof, is there anything you'd like to add? And that might take the form of going over terrain we've already partially traversed, but where you want to say something more. Or it may be that there are things you want to talk about that I've just missed in my question.
I think I'll do it. Can I do a plug? Well, Rob Watson and I've just submitted a book to Routledge about a week ago,
Oh,
which
do
yeah,
plug
that's
away.
really
Yeah.
great. And it's called The Politics of Deception, Young People's Youth Participation in an Age of Global Crisis. And it documents the ways in which the governments, NGOs, institutions, schools, universities, whatever, have promoted and valorised the idea of youth participation, as we do more generally, say, oh, civic participation is really good. And it documents in about 12 chapters the way in which that happens or has happened, when in fact it's the last thing that governments actually want to do. That most of the youth participation forums, most, not all, are highly managed, highly governance. We call it the governance model. The agendas are set. Most of those who are involved in it, at least at government level, are not representative in the sense that they're elected, but they're appointed. And we hope the sort of end on the uptick, that there will be, and maybe this is just naive optimism, that we can reflect and on how we can do it better, and what young people actually can bring to the table, and what needs to be done to ensure that they can, in different ways, participate in decisions that directly affect them. Because after all, they're going to be on this earth for a longer period of time than us. And I think, as we documented in the Lancet report, young people are affected more adversely than older people for various reasons. Many have got to do with most of them living in the global south and them having less sort of ability to protect themselves, more vulnerability to sort of disease because they're physically developing, need, you know, that may be affected more by disease or the absence of, you know, a nutritious diet and so forth. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Congrats on the new book that you and Prof. Watson
Sorry for
finished. And I hope that when it comes out, perhaps you and he will come back to the pod and talk about it.
That'd be great. Yeah, well, I'll get you a copy. We've actually got it in open access, not the hard copy. So people should be able to get a copy, or at least get the chapters when it comes out, which will hopefully be soon.
Fantastic. Thank
All
you
right.
again. It was lovely. I've learned so much from reading your work, as I say to many people in this podcast, and it's always true. But I've also learned a lot from listening to you today. Thank you for your generosity and your brilliant work.
And thank you for the invitation, Toby. It was fun talking to you.